you want to jump in here? We just want to welcome everybody this afternoon.
Yeah, hi everybody. It is so nice to see everybody. It feels like it's been a really long time. I also feel like started the school year just like it feels like years every week, you know, with so much going on. So appreciate everybody making time and excited to have us together and to be doing our, inaugural curriculum specific learning groups, and excited for this to be its own, my perspectives learning community within the Strong Start Network that will bring together throughout the year.
Exactly. Ditto. So just as
I also, can you guys hear me okay? Is there weird background noise? No. Okay, great.
Not at all.
I'm in the process of moving and my family is staying in a hotel. So I'm in a hotel lobby for this, and there's like weird elevator music. So I didn't know how disruptive it was to you guys, just distracting to me, but hopefully not to you all.
We can't hear you. Man, talk about dedication,
okay,
right?
Okay, good.
Thank you, Jetta, for joining us. All right, guys, so we've seen this slide before. This is that little kind of high-level overview of where we've been as a network and where we're headed. And as you can see, now that it's fall and we're into the school year, we are really zeroing in, looking at our curriculum implementation. Like Jetta said, we've kicked off these curriculum-specific deep dive sessions. We'll actually have more of them in the spring semester than we do this fall semester, just due to timing. It really was kind of an accident, but nevertheless, we are excited to dive deep into our curricular resources and to think about our improvement efforts. And with that, Jetta, if you'll head to the next slide. Just a reminder from our August call that as a network, we have this kind of model for improvement, right? We do some goal setting. We want to get really specific about what we want to accomplish as a network. And so we had some guiding questions that we looked at back in August. And then we know that, you can't improve what you can't measure, right? So we need to be specific about how we'll know we're making an improvement. And part of that will be looking at some of the tools that we've looked at already as a network, such as our IPG tool, or looking to some resources that are a part of our curriculum materials to know that we are making progress toward our goals. And as you know, we look at student work in our network, and that's a wonderful way also to see the impact of our learning that we are engaged in as professionals and the impact that's having on our students. And then lastly, this last piece of our model for improvement is that taking action, or this kind of cycle, learning cycle that we are in as professionals. We're learning a little bit, we're trying some things out in our classrooms, we're coming together to reflect and to share. And so you'll see these three symbols kind of pop up throughout our session as just a reminder that, Jed and I are being very intentional about the design of these sessions and to make a connection across our goals that we've set as both teams and as individuals, how we're measuring progress toward those goals, and then what action we believe will help get us to the improvement we're seeking. So with that, Jetta, I think we're going to look at some dispositions in action. Is that correct?
Yeah. So these are our Strong Start. Oh, go ahead. You go ahead, Bethany.
You sure? Okay. All right. So we just want to start off our afternoon with thinking about our Strong Start Network dispositions. We've looked at these before. We did some things with them this summer and last spring. So take just a minute, kind of individually, and I believe we're doing this in the chat, right, Jetta? All right. So which of our Strong Start Network dispositions has been the most prominent or dominant? Which one has been a prominent or dominant need, for you in these opening weeks of school, and why, right? Have you felt that call to really be open-minded, to be disciplined? Are you being responsive to evidence, self-reflective, action-oriented, collaborative, or systems-focused? And so which one feels the most prominent or dominant as you kicked off the school year, and why? So we'll give you a minute to think that through and to get your thoughts in the chat. Hey, honey. So as you're dropping your thoughts in the chat, we're a small group since we're curriculum specific this time and we're not the whole network. So of course, feel free to share out as well if you'd like to. On your mic.
I'm gonna go ahead and speak out just because
Yes, please, thank you.
we've got several that we're thinking about. Of course, there's several of us here. So, for one, we're thinking like response to evidence. So, we got that Tennessee ready data back, not what we had hoped for. So we're just trying to be responsive with that by being action oriented and taking our new curriculum and really being open-minded with it and just like embracing that and trusting the process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that out.
You're welcome.
Oh, I see Christy has added open-minded with some of the changes taking place within the district. Yes, anytime there's change, right? That's one of our dispositions that comes into play, and being self-reflective. And that connects to what Jetta said about even in the busyness of being very action-oriented, how important it is to take some time to be self-reflective. Any others, either in the chat or on the mic? Yeah, Tiffany says self-reflective. All right, well, keep these in mind as we head on through the session, and you'll notice the little light bulb symbol pop up at different times in the session as just a reminder that there's something about that activity that calls into focus one or more of these dispositions. And again, these dispositions are just the way we kind of interact either with the content or each other, and certainly with our improvement goals in mind.
Okay. With that, we are going to talk a little bit about our Strong Start Network team and member goals.
Love it. Guys, thank you so much for sharing those. So some of our leaders submitted like a group-wide goal, almost like a team goal. And we asked all members to submit a personal goal related to your Strong Start Network work. Sorry, that sounds kind of silly. But the gist is, these goals will inform the content of our learning experiences. So even as we headed into today and Jed and I were looking at those goals that you submitted, it helped us stay focused as to what you all are trying to accomplish as network members and as teams. We'll both assess progress toward and revisit these goals pretty often throughout the year. And of course, we'll share out our progress, right? We're part of a network, and part of our learning is grounded in the fact that we learn from each other. And there might be something that you're doing in your context that could benefit somebody in their context. So we want to make sure that we lift up our learnings and share that progress with each other. And we'll do that in our retreats, which we have coming up in November and February and next summer, and also in some group reflection meetings, such as the one we'll have at the end of this semester and that we'll have at the end of next semester. And what was interesting is just, as we looked kind of across both the team goals and the individual goals, we saw some trends, which is kind of exciting. Writing was certainly a trend across several teams and across several of you as individual teachers and leaders. Student conversations and really maximizing those. Vocabulary, which, woo, that worked out great, right? This is our first session. We're diving deep into vocabulary. Maintaining rigor popped up across several of our goals. Student independence, like how do we help students with their own agency and being more independent, especially in the reading and writing process, and then the use of text evidence, helping our students do that more effectively. So with that, like I said, we'll use these goals to kind of guide our work, and we'll certainly revisit them throughout the school year.
Okay, so our topic for today is vocabulary. So we are going to get started with a quick team builder. And there is some complex academic vocabulary on this list, a list of vocabulary words. We're going to send you to breakout rooms. And there is a Google Doc. Bethany, if you wouldn't mind adding the link for that Google Doc to the chat. In your breakout room group, you're going to write a story. with a beginning, middle, end characters plot that incorporates these vocabulary words. I will say you are happily allowed to Google meanings if needed. Don't worry. Some of these are unfamiliar to me as well. I tried to pick some challenging words for you all. So don't feel embarrassed to do that. You don't have much time. I'm giving you like 5 minutes. So it's got to be like a speed story here. I will also in your breakout rooms I think I put them in the Google Doc at the top of the Google Doc so you can see them there when you go to write your stories.
Yep, and I see several
okay.
folks popping into the document. So I was going to ask if it looks like it's working for everybody, but
okay, super.
Hey,
right.
Jetta.
Yes, ma'am.
So I noticed that Lincoln is all in one group together. Would you like the Eastridge group to be all in one group together? Because it seems that we've done ours in our own individual rooms and they only have one person representing their team. Would you like us to do that as well?
We did that because I think they're all in the same room together. Lincoln
Right.
if you guys are in separate rooms, you can, you're in the same room as well.
We're in the same building.
It's fine. So you'll just be in your own virtual room together then. That way you don't have to get up and move right now. We can send you to your virtual breakout room still. That's fine.
Thank you, Tracy.
Okay, great. All right. We're going to send you to breakout rooms and we will see you back in 5 minutes. This is a speed test. Go.
Please.
I'm like, am I just gonna run back and forth like this? I don't know.
You all are so creative.
Picture was this. Was
You all have
I
Bethany
understood,
like
and I had unhooked it, and now my
cackling.
sound's not working. You know, I had to click.
I'm gonna mute some of you guys. No problem. No problem. I see the panel here. Okay. Can you guys hear me okay? This is my internet. Okay, great. You guys really made the most of this, made some very creative stories in a very short amount of time, and used some complex vocabulary to do it. Tell me, would one or two people mind unmuting yourselves and just telling me what did that experience feel like, trying to like use those words quite quickly, apply them to a story? How did it feel?
Amy, I like your face. You're like
panicked.
panic.
Because in my mind, I was trying to get the words that I'm like, okay, what goes with which? What goes here, here?
You're also trying to connect some words.
Great. So panicked. Anyone else feel the same or different?
I think working as a group made it easier, and we kind of like one person was in charge of writing the narrative and everybody else was telling me what words. Like we started by defining the words so that we could create a story that we knew would work with that.
Okay, great. But you really had to like all hands on deck to accomplish that. Good. I wanted us to start off this session on vocabulary with this experience, a bit of a student empathy experience of putting ourselves in our student seat, because this is often what we ask students to do, right? We give them some complex vocabulary words they're not familiar with. We, quickly give them the definitions and then we ask them to use them and kind of throw them into the fire, just like I did all of you. And, you all are smart, thoughtful adults who have, a wealth of intellectual resources to draw upon to do this. But for our middle schoolers, a task like this can be really challenging and intimidating. And I'd also argue doesn't really give them the opportunity to build their vocabulary knowledge, right? Because they're, just sort of frantically using it. Maybe they're using the words in context, maybe they aren't. But what we really want to think about for today's session is how do we give students those rich opportunities for authentic use of their vocabulary in sustained ways over time so they can really build their vocabulary knowledge. But hopefully everybody leaves here using inchoate over their family dinner discussions tonight. That's my so I hope for all of you following this. It's a challenge. Okay, so for our objectives for today's curriculum specific vocabulary deep dive session, we're going to understand the role of vocabulary instruction in knowledge building and fluent skilled reading. We're going to identify which vocabulary is highest leverage and most in need of explicit instruction. And then we're going to talk about what are some of the best practices in our high quality instructional materials for vocabulary instruction. So here's our basic agenda for the session. We're going to talk a bit about why do we teach vocabulary? What's the role of vocabulary instruction in building skilled fluent readers? Then we're going to spend some time on what vocabulary should we teach, like what vocabulary is actually called out and explicitly taught in our instructional materials, and why is this the vocabulary that's selected to do that? And then hopefully, if we have time to get to all this, we'll get to the how piece, which is how vocabulary instruction is, what's effective and how is that supported in our instructional materials. So that is our agenda. We're going to start with this why piece. So why do we even teach vocabulary? You probably already have some opinions on that, but I'm going to give you some additional context here on that. So this is a very famous model of reading. It was designed by Dr. Marilyn Adams. It's called the 4-part processing model of reading. And we often actually use this in foundational skills instruction when talking about how young readers become fluent and skilled readers, but it is absolutely applicable and important to understand for our middle school readers as well. And just to orient you a little bit to this graphic, it's gonna be a little bit intimidating here. She's saying that these are the components that go into being a skilled fluent reader, right? On the bottom, you have the intake of speech through the phonological processor, how we hear sounds and language, and then print, which we take in through our orthographic processor in our brains, right? How we read words as we take them off the page. And those both interact with the meaning processor in our brains, right? Where we take what we hear, we take what we read in print, and we make meaning of it. The green box there is the context processor, which is the knowledge that we bring to the text, right? Our own experiences, our knowledge of the world, our knowledge of vocabulary that we bring to a text that inform our ability to make meaning of the text in that yellow box there. So that was a very rapid speed course in Marilyn and Adams' version of the 4-part processing model. But I'm curious, when you look at this graphic, where do you think vocabulary fits in? Like, where is knowledge of vocabulary important for these different processors to operate effectively for skilled readers? So take a second to think about that. And if you have some thoughts or ideas, if you could type them in the chat box. So where do you think vocabulary might help some of these processors operate? I'll give everybody a minute. Megan says meaning processor. I agree. I think vocabulary plays a really important part in how students are understanding the meaning of the text. Any other thoughts for our chat box? Context processor, definitely. So I will highlight a couple of things to keep in mind. One is, as you guys called out in some of your answers there, vocabulary helps us make this connection between context and meaning, right? When we bring knowledge of the vocabulary of the text that we're reading to the text that we're reading, right? As I read To Kill a Mockingbird, as I know some of the vocabulary in that text, it helps me make meaning from the text itself. That's kind of an obvious one, but I think it's worth and valuable to say. One thing that's important to keep in mind, all of these processes, the more knowledge we have, the more fluid these processes are and the less, laborious they are for our brains as we're reading. And so when we don't know vocabulary, we have to rely on additional context or meaning in the text to help us bootstrap our understanding of the text. So it actually makes our reading more challenging and slows us down, right? Because we have to use other resources to help us understand the meaning of the text without that vocabulary knowledge. The other piece to keep in mind is that knowing the vocabulary actually helps supports our fluency as a reader and our orthographic mapping, right? Just being able to quickly recognize words that we have committed to long-term memory makes that orthographic mapping process even faster and more fluid for our readers. So knowing that vocabulary actually improves their speed and automaticity as readers as well. One other important piece to keep in mind as well, in terms of the way that vocabulary impacts students as readers, is this idea of semantic networks. Semantic networks are the implicit activation of related ideas and vocabulary that we have while reading or listening to a text. So this image here is an example of a semantic network, right? If I'm reading a text about mammals, I'm making all sorts of connections in my brain without even thinking about it because I have a knowledge base around mammals, right? I know that they're animals, they're vertebrates, I can have a cat as an example of one. And then I have certain characteristics of cats that I keep in mind as well, right? And my brain is making all those connections without me even having to think about it. And children that have a wider breadth of knowledge and vocabulary build wider and stronger networks of information to draw upon while they're reading or listening to a text, right? And so they're able to make more connections and have a deeper understanding of the text, the greater their semantic networks are. So the key takeaway here is that building vocabulary makes you a stronger reader. And that's why it's so crucial that we spend instructional time there. So just take a moment and pause and reflect on this question, which is, why do you think vocabulary instruction is important for our middle school students? And how does it impact their development as readers or as students in general? And we have a, it's not a Padlet, a Jamboard link. Bethany, if you'll add that to the chat box for everyone to answer these questions and reflect on this question. So I'm going to give everybody just about 2 minutes to respond to the question on the Jamboard, and then we'll come back together as a group here.
So Jetta, just as a quick recap about Jamboard, right? So they'll just choose a sticky note, right? And then just respond to these questions in sticky note form, correct?
Great. Yes. Thank you, Bethany. Okay, so I see lots of great posts there of people making connections to vocabulary and building knowledge. I see connections to vocabulary and writing and vocabulary and fluent reading. So exciting to see all those connections you guys are making, and I completely agree with all of them. And I want us to hold on to this as we start to talk a little bit about what vocabulary we teach and how we teach it, because I think it's important to, you know, in the day-to-day activities of our looking at our curriculum, it can just be like, oh, here's the vocabulary lesson I'm supposed to do. But really grounding yourself, and this is a really key component for students to grow and develop as readers. So let's move on to the what, which is what vocabulary do we teach? And why is this the vocabulary that's selected in our instructional materials? So this is a slide we looked at in our summer retreat, but I just wanted to ground us here because we talked so much over the summer about the connection between building knowledge and vocabulary. And just remind, and this connects to the semantic network slide that we were looking at earlier. But remember that these two, building knowledge and vocabulary, are two sides of the same coin, right? Like as we build knowledge on a topic, we learn more vocabulary associated to it, and actually makes it easier for us to retain that vocabulary later because we have that semantic network and that breadth of knowledge for the vocabulary to, you know, connect to in our brains. It's no longer just like an isolated word like inchoate. We've learned a body of knowledge around that word that helps it remain sticky in our minds. And you may remember this statistic from our research citation from the summer, but I think it's a really powerful one. So just want to call everyone's attention to it again, that reading or listening to a series of texts on the same topic can yield as much as 4 times the vocabulary growth as like a direct instruction on the vocabulary. Just me telling you the meaning of inchoate versus you reading or listening to me using that word in text around topics over a series of time. So that is really powerful, and a reason why having vocabulary instruction embedded into our instructional materials, into the text that students are reading and writing about is so crucial.
Jetta, that also makes me think about how the curricular materials are designed in terms of how they bundle text, you know, like in the early grades where they were doing text sets. And that was a big piece of the work the last several years in Tennessee, was kind of shifting in that direction for K-3. And now we've also seen it in this adoption even for middle and high school. And just that connection to vocabulary instruction and the research you just shared.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you are engaging in a unit that's like built around a specific topic, and students get to encounter that academic vocabulary over multiple stories, that is really, really powerful. And, you know, this visual is just to remind us of that idea that when we have a schema around a topic, when we've built knowledge around a topic, that new vocabulary is more likely to stick. And I'm curious if anybody can recall an example of vocabulary from our shrimp text that we read this summer. And if so, can you unmute yourselves and say it out loud? Oh, Lincoln Heights Middle School in the chat box. Anna Straka, yes, good job. I think that's a great example that you guys were able to do that very quickly, right? That is not a word you have, I guarantee you have used since our July retreat. But because we spent time building some knowledge around Anna Straka, you were able to call it up right now because you had the semantic web around it. So that's really, I'm glad you guys remember that.
What about ephemeral? I remember that word.
Ephemeral. Yeah, exactly.
I haven't used that since July.
Okay, great. And then remember, we looked at this slide over the summer retreat too, but wanted to frame our conversation around vocabulary around this too, right? That our tiers of vocabulary, right? That tier 1 is our, you know, everyday speech. These are the vocabulary that we're using commonly when we talk to our friends, family, colleagues. Tier 2 is general academic language that you might find across disciplines. Like ephemeral, I would consider an example of that. You might encounter that in a literature class, or in this case, like a science class as well. And then domain specific language. Anna Straka is definitely in the tier 3 domain specific language that is specific to your academic discipline. So keep those tiers in mind, but we're going to think a little bit. I'm going to give you some criteria, and this is how our instructional materials frame and think about which words do we actually teach, right? Because there's plenty of words students are going to encounter in text that they don't know the meaning of, right? You're not going to be able to spend instructional time teaching every one of those words to your students, right? And so we have to figure out how do we prioritize which words we spend more time on, and understand why we do that. So this chart is like a little cheat sheet to help you remember how we think about this and how your instructional materials think about this. So words that merit relatively more time and attention are words that tend to be more abstract, right? Words that have multiple unrelated meanings or nuances to them. Or lastly, meanings or shades of meaning that are not likely part of students' experiences, right? I think ephemeral is actually a really good example of that, since Bethany just mentioned it, right? It's kind of an abstract concept. It has some nuance to it depending on the context it's used in, right? So in a text like the text we were reading this summer, spending some time on ephemeral and what that means might be very appropriate. Words that merit relatively less time or attention are words that are very concrete, right? It's easy to just like quickly have single meanings that can easily be communicated to students, or have meanings or shades of meaning that are part of students' experiences. So our instructional materials take a systematic approach to vocabulary instruction, and my perspective most certainly does this in thinking about which vocabulary words to spend time on. And so one way to think about prioritizing this is like, what are the words that are essential to understanding the text? In our text that we read this summer, if you didn't understand what ephemeral meant, you weren't going to understand what ephemeral ponds were or how those were affecting the fairy shrimp, right? So it was really important that you have that understanding of that vocabulary word, or a word that's likely to appear in a wide range of future text students will read, right? We want to make an investment in words that will really help them grow as readers. Or lastly, part of a semantic word family that we know will help build up those semantic networks for students. So we're going to do an activity here in a minute to kind of try out some of this. And I'm going to have you think about which words. I'm going to have you look at a passage in just a moment and think about which words might require less time to learn, and which words might we want to spend more time, instructional time on. And so remember that for the less time, we're thinking about a couple of things. We're thinking about, is it concrete? Does it describe, and something that might be familiar to students? For something that might require more time, you're thinking about, is it abstract? Does it have multiple meanings, etc.? The other thing you're thinking about in this quadrant is it a word that can be learned from the context of the text? So when I read that word in the context of the passage or in the context of the sentence, can I figure out the meaning of that word on my own as a skilled reader? Or is it unclear? And so I might need some support and instruction from my teacher on that. Or, as I said there, the meaning needs to actually be provided to the student for them to be able to access the meaning of that word. That might be a little bit confusing, but I think as you guys jump into this activity, you understand it more. So let me show you what you're going to do. I'm going to give you guys some time here. They're easier. I have identified some words in blue that I want you to categorize in those quadrants, right? So stemmed, medium, gust, opium, stricken, Ouija board, ghostwriters, plentifully. Right? I want you to go through those words, read the passage, and then look at this quadrant, which is also in your handouts, and try and place those words. I'm not asking, this is not like a quiz or a test to get this right. I just want you to kind of go through the activity here of trying to think through which of these words might require less time because they can be learned from context, or which are more abstract and need more instructional time from me as the teacher. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm going to give everybody just like 3 minutes here, read the passage, do the quadrant on your own, and then we'll kind of share out and reflect as a group.
And I dropped the materials link in the chat again if anybody needs it.
Okay, we'd love to come back together here and just hear from a few folks what that felt like, or what was challenging about doing that, or what were you wondering about as you did it? Any reflections from trying that out? Like how there's a different person all the time on Lincoln Heights Middle video screen. You guys rotate who's in charge of the typing, I can tell.
Team effort.
I would love to hear a few reflections. Like, was this easy? Was it hard? You're like, I have no idea. This was like too confusing. What were your reflections trying that out?
We think that it's a bit challenging because we're trying to think about it from students' perspective, and so like what would they need to, what would they struggle with? Because it's different than what we struggle with.
Yep. And I think this is one reason I wanted you guys to do this is luckily my perspectives does that require some explicit instruction, and that is incredibly helpful. But as you just sort of mentioned in your comment there, you have to put yourselves in your students' perspective, in your students' shoes, right? You know your students best. And part of the criteria here you see is like, what is familiar to students? And my perspectives curriculum writers don't know necessarily what's familiar to your students, right? You have the best understanding of that. And so there is a place here for you to be what we called last year, a critical consumer of your instructional materials, right? As you're going through what words they've identified, are there additional words that you think your students will need more time with, right? Or are there words that they're spending time on that you're like, no, my students have that, they don't need time there, right? And so the ability for you to prioritize within your instructional materials based on your knowledge of your students is partially why I wanted you to do this activity, because I do think putting yourself to that point, putting yourself in your students' understand where they might struggle really to hear about really understanding students' background.
You broke up just a little bit, Jetta, but I think we caught the gist of it.
Okay, great. Okay, great. You guys were all frozen for me, so I didn't know if you could still hear me. So you have spotty internet here. So this is not an exact science here, right? But I kind of went through and thought about, which of these are more abstract words, which can students kind of figure out from context. And I think one of the takeaways here for me in doing this activity is if I were reading this passage with students, I would want to spend some time on agony, right? Because it's a word that's really central to the meaning of that passage, but also a word that has a lot of nuance to it, right? And a word that's valuable for students as they go on for future text, right? And so me just doing this like quick sorting activity, it took me a few minutes to do, helped me kind of prioritize which vocabulary would be most useful to students.
And Jetta, I'll just add that I think to speak to your point about that kind of consumer, like be a critical consumer of our materials, but to also, you saw that little light bulb. I think being responsive to evidence in that we are looking at our materials, like I can look at a word in that text and say, is the meaning clearly provided in some way, like an embedded definition or, that kind of thing? Or is it really just going to be left up to the reader to infer, like in agony? It never really says what it is. It gives some examples and you might have to infer. So in that case, like grounding my thinking and decision-making as a teacher in what I see in the text, because that's what students would have access to in front of them, can also help me through that, prioritizing those words or thinking about where they fit in the context of that quadrant.
Yep, I think that's a great point. I think an activity like this also helps get through some of our own biases of like words that we really like or are interested in versus words that really help unpack the meaning of a text for students. Okay, great. So let's talk lastly a little bit about how vocabulary instruction, what do we look for in effective vocabulary instruction, and how do our instructional materials set us up to do this? So this is some criteria from Beck and McEwen, who are, have written like the canonical text on vocabulary instruction in the literacy classroom. And they sort of give 3 pillars to strong vocabulary instruction. First is that words are in context, right? We read them in text, we write with them in text, right? We are not just giving vocabulary word list in isolation. The next is students have several opportunities, multiple opportunities. I've seen different studies on this around like how many times students have to use a word in an authentic, either reading it or writing it to commit it to long-term memory. But I think the short answer is it's multiple times, it's several times before we can take that word and solidify it in our memory. And then lastly, asking students to engage in production of that vocabulary in writing or speaking, right? It's not enough to just read the vocabulary in text. They need to write using the vocabulary and speak using the vocabulary. So that leads us to sort of our spectrum of explicit vocabulary instruction and what this might look like in our classroom practice. So we can kind of move, and you can think about our quadrant here, right, of the words that might require less instructional time from us because they're more concrete or because the meaning is provided in the text in some way, or require more instructional time from students on the heavier touch side. And so for our light touch vocabulary, we're thinking here about making, giving quick student-friendly definitions. Oftentimes this is just a quick tell it, right? Like, hey, if you've never played with a Ouija board, it's a board that people sometimes use to try and like communicate with the, other spirits, or I don't know. It's like quick Ouija board definition. But it's just a quick definition that we provide to students. Some sort of visual of key definitions, and My Perspectives does this often, right, with sort of call out boxes for vocabulary for students, and quick illustration or image to just give the definition to students, or a quick example for them to look at. Versus spending more instructional time on vocabulary, a higher touch where we might be generating different examples or non-examples to solidify our understanding of that vocabulary and the nuances of meaning behind it. Asking students to use it in conversation, using it in writing, studying a whole word family around that word is a heavier touch of our vocabulary instructional pieces. I also wanted to call your attention to the way that vocabulary plays into our the instructional practice guide. It gets called out in an indicator. Their correction to indicator C specifically is around questions and tasks attend to the words, academic vocabulary, phrases, and sentences within the text. And then I would also argue that indicator C that's around building knowledge is also, it gives attention to vocabulary here, right? The questions and tasks are sequenced to build knowledge. And I just wanted to call our attention to this because we're using the instructional practice guide as our instructional vision for what we think strong literacy instruction looks like. And so want to name that in this, it's important that vocabulary is used aligning to those same indicators those same descriptions that we looked at in the Beck and McEwen research. It's used within the text, and it's used, to build students' knowledge, semantic knowledge of the vocabulary. Okay, so we're going to do some deep dive into your own instructional materials now, and I'm going to give you guys some time in your school-specific groups to discuss. We asked you to bring a sample lesson from My Perspectives with you, and I want you to think about in your groups and just discuss, where do you see vocabulary explicitly taught in that lesson? What instructional strategies are used? How can you, use this to address correction 2, build knowledge or deeper understanding? Is the vocabulary instruction in this lesson lighter or heavier touch? Where do you think your students might struggle? And would there be additional support you'd want to provide students with the vocabulary that you see in that lesson? So just kind of digging into your own materials, thinking about what vocabulary instruction looks like and how it's approached in that lesson, and discussing that with your colleagues. Questions before we go to breakout rooms?
And John, this time we're just going to have Lincoln Heights be a group and we'll put all of the Eastridge folks in one room. Okay, awesome.
Okay, great. I'm going to give you guys about 8 minutes to discuss, and we'll come back as a whole group and debrief.
And Tracy, since you're our only leader that's here, we won't do a separate leader breakout. We'll just let you meet with your teachers, okay? Yeah, we were having a good conversation.
I'm so sorry.
As always.
Time is a finite resource, you know.
Good.
I would love to hear from a couple people what you guys talked about. What were your takeaways on vocabulary instruction in my perspectives?
Oh, Lincoln Heights, talk about the word maps, word walls, any of that kind of stuff. You all had some ahas around that.
Okay, so one of the things that my perspectives does is that at the very beginning of the unit, it kind of works on how you're building upon these words and these vocabulary words that go with the unit. Not necessarily the vocabulary words, but just words that are focused on the actual theme or the topic that we're talking about, which in our case happens to be, for 8th grade, milestones on the path to growing up. And so you begin with a very short, small nonfiction narrative, and then it just builds. And so each time you start a text on your anchor text or new text, you can build upon those words, which would be excellent and is a great reference tool when you get to the performance task, because they're going to be writing about their own personal rite of passage and then their own milestone in their life that has had significant impact on them. So using that, I've just had an aha moment, because one of my other teammates has already been doing that. She's already created an anchor chart. And I thought, oh, we're getting ready to write this nonfiction narrative about their life. So why don't we go back and we revisit, even though we filled that in and we've talked about those words, but actually have that out for them to see and reference as they write.
Very cool. Thank you. Yeah, just the power of like word walls and those semantic maps being visual and kind of coming back to those, especially ahead of a performance task. We're expecting them to use those words.
Absolutely.
That was cool. I love listening to that group talk about their work.
I've voluntold Christy to share out from our group.
All right, Christy.
Okay, so one of the things that we talked about in our group was just the consistency with the curriculum from grade level to grade level, so that the vocabulary that they're using, the activities that they're using, you don't have to reteach that with every year. And so some of the activities like ranking the vocabulary words, we were talking about that, how that was such an eye-opener as well, because you can see background knowledge of the student, words that you thought that they might know, and they really don't. So it kind of works, a couple of different ways, but we were very impressed with the consistency, because I work with 2 different grade levels. So for struggling learners, which is basically the population that I work mostly with, that really helps tremendously, because as they travel up the grade levels, they are already familiar with these processes. And so that helps them. They don't have to learn the new type, what the expectations are. So we really like that.
Great, thank you all. It was really wonderful to hear everybody's, reflections and applying the content of what we talked about in the session today to your own instructional materials, and getting a chance to kind of dig into that with your colleagues. So thank you all for such thoughtful discussions. And I will hand it over to Bethany. We have a lot of different next steps and things on the horizon. So I will hand it over to her to share all that.
Will do. All right. So remember last time when we were together, I was like, everybody take a deep breath. right? What this little list may make you go, what the what? But I want us just to take each item, kind of talk about what it is, why it's there, what its purpose is, and look at it as part of this journey to the next time we're together, which really isn't until our retreat. And that's because we're doing some asynchronous work through the month of October. That old pesky thing called fall break's coming up. I know we're all probably in desperate need for a fall break. But we didn't want to ask any one group to come back during fall break. So everybody's kind of spread out across the month of October. So we're going to still engage in some things as a network. We're just going to do it asynchronously. So as I kind of walk through these things, it's going to feel like a lot, but it's really like a September to October and then October to November, which is our retreat. And so don't worry. You know me by now. I'll probably send a handy dandy checklist or something, but I will make sure we walk everybody through and give you all the links you need. So don't worry about, trying to capture any of that right now, but just want to give a high level overview. All right. So with that, Jed, if you'll show us our calendar of events, you can see what I was referencing. So we're here in September 14, 15, 16, but we don't really get back together as a network until November 9th. That's our retreat, okay? Because everybody's fall break was just kind of across the month of October. And so we're just going to engage in some asynchronous things as kind of that bridge from September to October and October to November. So let's walk through those. So first is going to be a reflection on vocabulary. So kind of the homework from today's session or reflection. So Jetta, next slide. So teachers, you have a specific reflection around vocabulary, and it's to implement a lesson, again, that's explicitly teaching vocabulary or has kind of maybe a heavier vocabulary focus. And you have 2 reflection questions. You're going to respond to those reflection questions via a Padlet. Okay, so I'm going to send you that link to that Padlet. Don't worry about trying to find it now, but you'll respond in a Padlet about your experiences. And then we're also asking, kind of similar to like a college class, respond to at least 2 of your colleagues' reflections. Okay, so that'll be part of this kind of follow-up as tied to vocabulary. And then also part of our work around this vocabulary lesson will be to collect some student work. So similar to last year, we'll have you choose kind of 5 student work samples from this lesson, and I'll share a Google folder link with you, just like last year, where you'll upload your samples into your team's student work folder. Okay, so teachers, you'll have a couple of reflection questions here and some student work. Leaders, you'll have something very similar. So Tracy, this would be you. And then Lincoln Heights, remind your leaders that they have homework too. All right, so Jetta, next slide. Oh, Jenna might be frozen. Oh, there it goes. Okay, so leaders have their own. Something looks a little funny here, but that's okay. Leaders, you'll observe 3 lessons with a focus on vocabulary. You'll really be thinking about that IPG tool, those 2 indicators that we looked at today. You'll have a couple reflection questions that you'll post on the Padlet. Same thing, you'll respond to a couple of your colleagues, and then you'll also collect some student work. So leaders, very similar, just a little bit of a different slant given your role. And then leaders also want to share an opportunity. We're going to jump into some leader learning walks. And our first one will be September 30th. This is in response to several suggestions in the leader survey that we have a chance to kind of pull together as a small group of leaders and think about our role as a leader in supporting this kind of work and vision in our buildings. So it'll be a mix of kind of in-person and virtual format on September 30th. More information to come, but we'll do a little bit of a deep dive session for our leaders, some in-person learning walks at your school focused on your team's Strong Start Network learning goal, some collaborative reflection, and like I said, more information to come, but just wanted you to go ahead and save that date for our learning walks. All right, now October, again, this is part of that asynchronous work. Just like last year, we did some empathy activities, and this will be some prep for our network retreat. So we're going to ask you to do a student interview and then observe that same student kind of in the context of your ELA classroom. And again, I'll give lots of support and what that looks like. And you can see there's actually an a document linked, but I'll share all of that with you. And then you'll submit those empathy interview and observation reflections via a Google form. And then last but not least, I already shared the book study chapters back when we did our our August email follow-up. But just a reminder, we're in the process of reading chapters 9 and 10. And this is the same kind of reflection protocol we used last time: triangle, square, circle, 3 points that stood out to you, something outside the box for you, and then circle questions still circling in your mind. All right, so with that, again, there's several things. So that vocabulary reflection, the book study, and the empathy mapping, all of that is part of this September to November kind of asynchronous work that we're doing as a network, all in preparation for our, hopefully, fingers crossed, in-person retreat that will happen in November. All right, so like I said, I'll send a follow-up. It'll have all the links you need, lots of directions. But as always, please feel free to email me if you have any questions. All right, Jetta, anything else you want to add before we wrap it up? Just like that, it's 4:45.
It was just great to see you all. Thank you all for making time for this afternoon. Excited to hear how vocabulary lessons go.
Ditto. All right, we'll hang around if anybody has any questions or wants to discuss anything, and we'll be in touch, right? We'll see you for sure, hopefully, though, in November. Bye, everybody. Thank you for being so engaged this afternoon.